Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn more on how to support the channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. This is part 2 of a series entitled Questionable Witnesses: An Atheist Teaches Life of Christ. Today we'll be looking at the introduction of the Gospel of John, which is in John 1 through 18. I'm teaching the Gospels much like I did many times in my churches as a pastor over the years, but now I am teaching it as an atheist. But being this is the first time that we have dealt with the Gospel of John, we're going to go over the issues of source, date, and authorship. As the series unfolds, we will get into the content of the Gospel along with many others. But let's get the basic of who the writer was, where he got his material, and when he wrote. The Gospel of John's authorship is anonymous, as the author never identifies himself by name. The only person who says this is written by John, the disciple of Jesus, is Irenaeus. But once again, that only gets you one witness, which doesn't even meet the biblical criteria of 2 or 3 witnesses. So we are left with some remarks the author makes about himself or another source, and the way the gospel is composed. The issues of the gospel is a very standalone stories in its pages. That is what we could be seeing here as an early Christian community with its own traditional stories about Jesus that are being preserved separately and then knit together by a later writer. The idea is further strengthened by how unique the material is compared to the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. As in the old writer John has found, you find very little in the other Gospels, and he rarely quotes the Old Testament as well. The way we have found various manuscripts of the Gospel indicate that the Gospel may well have been a product of a community of believers that had certain views of Jesus that was different from others, which is further supported by the epistles of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which are written in a very similar style to this Gospel and often indicate that they have the same authorship. What I might then liken it to is like an Edda in literature, that different community members preserve their own oral traditions about the life of Jesus, maybe in a written form, and then at some point these traditions were collected and put in order by a single scribe at a later date to preserve them as the people who knew these stories were dying perhaps. The purpose of the book is clearly stated, but only in the last chapter, which does indicate that this is a possible addition to the book. The questions about where these stories came from started early, so the scribe who compiled them makes a statement about this. I really feel that the source of these stories may well have been a disciple of Jesus, but that it is not clearly stated. The disciple whom Jesus loved is stated as the source of these traditions, but it's not clearly stated that he was the writer. We know that his testimony is true, indicates more of a community acknowledgement of the source, not in the authorship of the actual book. In the end, there's a lot of conjecture all over the place as to who the author is, but we do know that his Greek is good and solid, and the gospel, along with the 3 letters, were probably written by the same person. Revelation style and content speak against him being the same author there. You get a picture of a scholar instead with John, who's compiling the stories into one book, and is also leader of the community in the letters, and that is all. Most people put the final product of the gospel at date about 90 to 110 AD, but some of the stories could have been preserved in earlier papyrus. The writer claims that one of his sources is the disciple whom Jesus loved, but whether this is the same person is debatable. The real problem is the uniqueness of the material, which appear nowhere else. The Gospel of John is mostly a standalone material with no other witnesses to it or accounts of it. It's a single witness with a lot of questions behind it. But to our text. Roughly, the writer is giving a very theological view of the origin of Jesus, that he is the Logos made flesh, God in human form. Many claims are made by the author about Jesus being the one and only begotten Son, that while many others are born of the will of man, Jesus becomes born of the will of God. If we boil it down, there are some very strong theological statements about Jesus that definitely have putting Jesus on a Superman status. God becomes flesh. Also, this is an issue through John the Baptist ministry. In the middle, as a testimony of Jesus who was early on, the one who would come after him would be greater than him. Of all the Gospels, the early ministry of John the Baptist appears in the most detailed form, though it is missing a lot of what the other writers write. The whole point of this introduction seems to be a theologically state who Jesus was out of the gate, and what John the Baptist said about him as an introduction. Like it was an early creed of the community. Perhaps the community had roots in both John the Baptist and Jesus. What we really don't see is any historical narrative, but rather a theological position supported or by the supposed words from John the Baptist. The problems are legion. The fact is that there is no other witnesses to these words of John the Baptist, and the theology is unique among the Gospels. The Gospel has a very strong Jesus is God message right out the gate. But the one thing that is missing is corroboration of the author, because the author doesn't name himself. This is more of a theological work than a historical one, right out the gate, pretty much by its own admission. It's an opinion about who Jesus was, not a desire to portray Jesus historically. So to recap the problems and why this is a questionable witness is, only Irenaeus says John the disciple of Jesus wrote this, and he says it 50 years plus after the fact, and he is the only witness to say so. The writer himself does not give his name, but gives his source as the very nebulous title, the disciple who Jesus loved. But there's no other witness that says this is true. Supposedly in the introduction we have the words of John the Baptist, but there's no corroboration of this with another source. In fact, John has some very unique statements by John the Baptist. The introduction is more of a theological statement of belief, like part of an early creed rather than a historical work. The author has perceived notions of who Jesus is before he even starts his narrative. He is not trying to be objective by his own admission later, as this is about having people know they can have eternal life through Jesus, not preserving history. The book has all the internal evidence that suggests the possibility of being a work knit together of stories that have been preserved by oral tradition and maybe by individuals who preserved little parts of the story in written form, and then a single work by a single scribe, as these letters are put back together and put into some sort of ordered narrative. And that perhaps this same writer was also kind of a leader of the community, as he writes 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, which are very similar in style and very much indicate the same author. In short, there's no way that we can constitute anything as good historical evidence. We can rightly out of the gate say this is hearsay, and that it should not be used in a court of law and represents more of a theological opinion rather than historical work. Probably some other notes about the text. We have the strongest statement of Jesus being God in verse 5. I know a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses like to disagree with that, but if you take a secular source like Arndt and Gingrich from the University of Chicago on the various New Testament words, the problem with this passage is that God and the Word are both in the nominative, for those of you who know Greek, which means they're both considered the subject of the sentence. And then you have the definite article, ho, that basically says that can go with either the Word or with the God. And in other words, a literal translation of the passage would be the Word was the God. And so we have a very strong statement in John about, John is definitely, the people that are the guy who's collecting these stories is what I think. It has a very strong opinion about who Jesus was, and the fact that he believes very much that Jesus was God, and so it's going to color his narrative, and he openly admits it almost right out of the gate. The real thing for me about this introduction is it's pretty much a theological form, and so all you really have, is this unique idea of Jesus being the Word made flesh, Word being definitely a correlation with Jesus, as well as the idea of Jesus being the light. So you have Jesus being the light and the Word. A definite reference back to the creation story in Genesis, where God just says, let there be light, and it was so. And in a very real way, the writer of John is kind of making that analogous to Jesus himself in a different way, but definitely very, very similar. I don't know, from my own perspective, I think what happened is you had this community maybe rallied around a disciple of Jesus Christ, who we don't really actually know who it is. It just says the disciple who Jesus loved, and there's no internal evidence or evidence elsewhere to assume that the disciple whom Jesus loved is John. That's purely church tradition. There's nothing there, as far as I can tell, that has any historical backing. And so we have this writer collecting the works and putting them together, and maybe it was a leader of this community that was rallied around an original disciple of Jesus, but we don't know who they are. And so they came up with some very unique patterns for how Jesus should be portrayed. So when I look at this, I don't see a work of a single author. I see a lot of oral tradition coupled with some preservation of stories. And then, as we go down the line, the writer basically is not so much the writer of the text as so much as he's taking all these oral traditions and maybe fragments of writings of stories of people that had stories and trying to put them in a narrative. It would kind of explain how maybe he starts out just trying to preserve the stories and not really put an order to them, because he starts with the ministry of John the Baptist and then he switches to Jesus cleansing the temple. And then there's this, the problem with John in a lot of ways is you have a lot of these individual encounters and they may not necessarily be in historical order. And it looks very much like at the beginning he's trying to preserve all the stories, and then later on he starts to put some sort of historical narrative to it as the gospel continues. So it's almost like he changes his method midstream in a certain sense. The Gospel of John for me is still my favorite. It really does make Jesus into Superman, and in a lot of ways, and that's very different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because Mark has a very human Jesus, and Matthew and Luke are still playing on the idea that of more of a Jewish Messiah view of Jesus. So it's not until we get John that John kind of exalts Jesus to this godhood status, and a lot of people argue about that. Well, for that last verse 5 in this introduction is always an arguable point, but it's not really. If you do good secular scholarship on the Greek, the word was the God. I'd have to say that you create some problems if he's just a God, because now we have, Christianity and all that stuff being polytheistic and not monotheistic, which they try to be, and then they introduce polytheism with the Trinity and they try to mishmash it. So there's a lot of confusion that comes out of this passage theologically too, because such a strong statement coupled with other statements from other authors kind of make things difficult. So that's kind of my take on this particular part. You're certainly welcome to ask questions and give comments in the comments section. I hope everybody is continuing to enjoy this series as we get started here. The next step is the genealogies, so we'll get to that. I want to thank everybody for stopping by. Like and share the video. I appreciate it, everybody that does that. Thank you very much. It's a great way to support the channel. Our mission here is to normalize atheism and deconversion, so people don't misrepresent what atheism is and don't misrepresent what deconversion and deconstruction are. So to that end, you can support the channel. My PayPal link is in the description. You can also become a member of the channel, which is the best way to support the channel, giving me that monthly support to continue to do what I do. So, and to all those who have done that, my members, to my citizens, to my Rabyd citizens, to my tribunes, thank you very much. You guys are awesome. I appreciate every single one of you, and so thank you very much. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around, and then it's over. And so you don't want to take all your time, your money, and opportunities and waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, but rather give them to yourself and to the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. You'll be happier if you do. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.